Thank you for joining us for the inaugural conversation for the Human Science Task Force. We're talking on quarantine culture today, so we're super excited that you have taken the time out of your day or evenings to join us. My name is Dr. Adam Gamwell, and I am the host and producer of a podcast called This Anthro Life, as well as the co-founder of Missing Link Studios, which is a media production agency that deals with social impact issues and societally important topics. And so obviously quarantine and COVID is one of the main social forces, biological forces facing the world today. And so we wanted to bring together some human scientists to help us think better about that. And in a broad sense, the Human Science Task Force is really just a coalition of human scientists, anthropologists, sociologists, behavioral economists, psychologists, folks that are interested in and have a belief that those who dedicate their lives to understanding the world and helping us see what's happening socially around the planet should have a larger impact on the discourse and what's happening around the world. So these inaugural conversations are part of this idea on this platform. And so we are using Mindshare, which some of you have seen. And so if you would like to, we're more than happy to have you post questions here for Dr. Briody as part of the conversation, as well as Astrid Countee, our MC. And so any questions that pop up during the conversation, please feel free to post them on the Mindshare app, and or if you want to on the YouTube page. Also, we'll be looking on there, and we'll have a Q&A at the end of the conversation. So for now, we will turn it over. I'm very excited to introduce our MC, Astrid Countee, and as well as our guest, Dr. Briody. So here we are. Thanks for joining.
I wanted to start us with your thoughts on what you think anthropology and its findings bring to decision makers and leaders at organizations.
I think the main thing that anthropologists bring is an understanding from an insider point of view. There are many people that work in organizations. They all have a perspective, but because they are part of the same organizational culture, that perspective has some alignment. There is some general consensus understanding of how that organization works, how people in that organization tend to react to things, how they do things, what they think about things. And so when you are managing a large firm or a large organization, you don't have access to that kind of insight except through your own personal experiences, which tend to be fairly narrow and well-defined. So the anthropologist has an ability to bring a much broader and holistic understanding to decision makers and help them see things that they themselves cannot see.
I know that you spent part of your graduate work also looking at work from an organizational and cultural perspective. How were you able to take some of the experiences that you had in graduate school or some of the insights that you had and then translate them in your career at GM and also with your consultancy that you run now?
Well, a funny thing happened when I was on the job market. I got a chance to go to General Motors and give a seminar, but they had very specific things that they wanted me to focus on. And I was told that I had to focus on 4 topics. I had to tell them a little bit about myself and my background. I had to tell them about my dissertation research, which was on migrant farm workers. I had to talk about some of my other research interests, and I had to tell them why General Motors should hire an anthropologist. And I had to do it in 20 minutes. So that in itself was quite a challenge, but in terms of why GM should hire an anthropologist, I made an argument to them that I still believe today. I said, look, I come from a background where I have done a master's thesis on janitors. I've done work with Catholic sisters and priests. And then my dissertation fieldwork was with farm workers. All of those groups were really focused on work. The work was different, but that was the commonality among them. So the idea of then going to General Motors and working with engineers, manufacturing people, salespeople, and so on, honestly, I couldn't see much different. I felt like I would encounter many of the same kinds of issues. I would use the same kinds of research techniques, and be able to help the company understand what is going on inside their company better because of the background and training I had.
Can you talk a little bit about why does it matter if you learn about the way people live? Why would that have anything to do with work? There's a lot of very structured business theory that doesn't really think about culture in that way. So
Right.
the thing is that that's your background and you've done this work for a lot of different circumstances. What do you think that means and why it makes a difference to approach it from this cultural perspective?
Well, there's one thing that comes to mind right away. It was a study that I did while at GM, and it had to do with decision making. Mm-hmm. There were 3 different engineering teams working together to produce a car that would be sold around the world. And it turned out they didn't get along at all. In fact, I was asked to come help them. And at the very first meeting, one of the German guys said to me, "You should have been at this meeting today. It was a classic." And then he pounded his fist on the table. So I knew there was something going on. And the upshot was that the 3 groups thought about making decisions in different ways. So for example, the group that composed Chevy and Pontiac thought about making decisions based on majority rule. And that's a very common way in which we make decisions here in the US. Saturn thought about making decisions from a consensus standpoint. In fact, 100% consensus, which is a far cry from majority rule, but consensus is also a way in which we operate in the US. Adam Opel, which was GM's German manufacturing arm at the time, made decisions that were leadership driven. So in other words, the leader would solicit input from his direct reports and use that to formulate a decision. And that's very consistent with German national culture. So those 3 ways of making a decision clashed. The people working on this global vehicle program did not understand why they were experiencing so many problems, but it was simply because they didn't have a common way of working together.
So what it sounds like is that as our economies have matured and become more globalized, we often don't consider that we're doing things a certain way because it's the culture that we're a part of. We just kind of do what we do because we think that's what everybody does.
Correct.
Until you encounter a situation where someone's doing something that seems strange to you and you're not quite sure why the pieces aren't fitting together. Is that
right?
Sound right? Yeah.
Exactly right. Yep. Until you make a mistake, you don't really understand. You make an assumption, and it's normal for us to do that. You make an assumption that the way you do something is the way everyone does something, when in fact, that's not the case.
And so since you've left GM and you've been running your consultancy, how have you found that your focus on culture has helped you to differentiate yourself from other consultants that maybe would do work with some of your same clients?
I think that the way an anthropologist goes into a work environment is quite a bit different. For one thing, our tendency is to talk to everybody. And by that, I mean a cross-section of people that work in the organization. So we are equally comfortable talking with people who are in entry-level jobs as we are with people who are in the C-suite. And that's because we have to be, because each of them represents a body of knowledge and a set of work practices that we know nothing about. And it's our job as anthropologists to try to learn what those are, why people do what they do, why they say they do what they do, and then whether or not what they say actually matches what they do. And so that's a key strength that anthropology brings, is this willingness to try to work with as many people as possible throughout the organization and try to understand work from their point of view. But at the same time, in the course of their discussions with these various people, problems emerge, issues emerge. And that's where the focus ends up being. That's not to say that the anthropologist is never given an initial problem to work on, because often they are. And in which case you try to solve whatever that particular problem is for the client. But in many cases, they just kind of want to learn what their culture is. Mm-hmm. And it never maps on exactly as they perceived it, because again, they represent a single person thinking about their culture rather than having the opportunity to talk to so many and analyzing it systematically so that you get at a broader, more comprehensive understanding.
And then once they do have a better understanding of the culture that's actually running it, then how does that affect their ability to make changes or make transitions? Because I know that a lot of the projects that you've worked on have been related to how they're going to enter a new market, or how they're going to deal with a changing market, or how they're going to make some changes internally, what it means to have new departments or to downsize and things like that. So how does learning about their culture help these leaders make these better decisions?
Usually the findings that you eventually share with the senior decision makers point you in a direction of change. And once you are pointed in that direction of change, then you try to work with them to think through what could they do? What might they do in order to address the issues that you have been able to uncover?
I know that you have also been really involved with the business anthropology community and also scholarship. And this part of what you do, the organizational culture and also the anthropology of work, also is a part of business anthropology. So from your perspective, how do you see the evolution of business anthropology and where it is now, and the way in which it can actually help to continue to push this, finding the area of change and also helping leaders be able to navigate those changes, especially in a time like now where so many things are changing about the way that we work. And it seems that many people are looking for the right next step to take.
I think that the anthropologist is there to act as a guide of sorts. Mm-hmm. So, for example, just abstracting from what many of us have experienced during this pandemic, so much of work is now online. It's going to be really tough for everyone who was working in an office job to just go back and do what they were doing before. For one thing, the jobs may not be there, but in the event that the jobs are there, when you would go back, there are questions. Would you go back for 40 hours a week? What about the idea of working part-time from home and part-time at work? What if the work environment can't accommodate social distancing? What if the work environment does accommodate social distancing? Perhaps they've put up those plexiglass barriers, or perhaps there are plans to have people wear masks, let's say, and be careful with social distancing. Then how do you run a group meeting under those circumstances? Do you all go into the conference room like you did before? Or do you use Zoom or some other platform? I mean, these are open questions that we just don't know exactly how things will turn out. But we know already that online work is possible for many more people than prior to the pandemic. And by that, I mean that online work has been normalized, so that virtual work is now normalized for a lot of people because it had to become normal.
So it's really interesting that you say that we probably won't go back, because there's a lot of discussion around when things go back to normal, when we get back to normal, which kind of implies that this is a temporary thing and then it's just for right now and we'll just go back to the way things were and that'll be fine. And I wanted to ask you, is that just all of us trying to cope with everything being so uncertain, so we really want to cling to something that we do know? Or are things like this, where so many people have had to shift the way that they work, are they really lines in the sand that are going to change the way that you work in the future? It's going to change how organizations even organize themselves in the future. I wanted to find out what you thought about that.
I think that we don't fully know what work will look like in the future. And I have only just talked about office work. Let's talk about manufacturing work. How will that change in the future? Again, with the issue, at least in the near term, of social distancing. How do you run a manufacturing facility? What if I had one person tell me a story recently? He's an electrician, and he said that he was working on a new building site, and they were installing the electrical system. And he said that in a very small area, there are 3 guys, and they're all working on the electrical system. So somebody's pulling wire, and somebody's cutting, and somebody's doing something else. He said, we're all on top of each other. How do we social distance?
Yeah, you can't.
No other room. I mean, this is where the electrical stuff goes. So what do? There are just a lot of questions, so we don't really know exactly what will happen, but I think we can say with a high degree of certainty that things are not going to be the same, and that people will have to accommodate, at least in the near term. Epidemiologists are expecting successive waves of COVID, and we also know that other pandemics can arise as they have in the past. We've just been fortunate enough not to have had to deal with too many of the recent ones, but other countries have. And so we have to be better prepared in many, many ways, not just from a work perspective, but a public health perspective in many, many ways.
So that kind of brings us to your most current research. So I know that right now you, and also with a couple of other partners, you're doing some research around the impact of COVID-19. Can you talk to us a little bit about that, and also about who you're working with and how the project came about?
Yes, I was speaking with our colleague and friend, Jo Aiken, who lives in Glasgow in Scotland. She was very interested in doing a project that would use her skills and knowledge and be a help to this whole COVID experience that people are undergoing. And I had been thinking along the same lines. In fact, I must have mentioned it to my family over a period of a week, probably every day. So I just felt at loose end, because I wasn't a frontline worker, and yet I felt like this was an opportunity. I just hadn't been able to settle on what it was. Right. And so based on my conversation with Jo, I said, well, we've got to involve one other person, Dawn Lehman. Dawn lives in the US, and I have worked with her in the past. And so the 3 of us came together and said, let's create a project where we talk to people about their lives and their work. So what would we focus on? Well, all of us at some level are really interested in work culture. We all also have other specialties. Dawn is a medical anthropologist by training. She has done a lot of work in areas of depression and various other stress-related issues. Jo has spent much of her professional life at NASA, where she has studied people that will be going into orbit. And I have spent most of my life in automotive, but we all had a very strong interest in people. We were interested, generally speaking, in work culture and in stress as it affects work culture. And so we thought, let's create a project about COVID, looking at how it has affected people and what strategies people have used, both at home and at work, to adjust or accommodate the pandemic.
So being that we all are social distancing, how are the 3 of you working together on this project?
Oh, it's great. We Zoom. Despite some negative feedback in some of the op-ed pages of the New York Times about Zoom, Zoom works for us. The 3 of us get on Zoom about once or twice a week we are in the process of conducting some preliminary interviews. And so we talk about what we think we're learning, and we're constantly comparing back and forth between the various sites and the various networks that we have accessed in order to get our sample.
So how are you going about and getting your sample in your interviews? Like, what's the methodology that you're using to do that?
Right. We started out with something called quota-based sampling, and the idea was that we would try to find people that fit into certain categories of employment. And we had 5 such categories. One of the categories is employed and working at home. So that would be someone who was able to take the job that they had and transport it basically and do it from their home. A second category was employed but working outside of the home. You might think of the essential workers.
Right.
Those that are working in the food industry who still have jobs, those who are working in medical, and so on. Then there was the category of worker who had been laid off for whatever sets of reasons related to the pandemic. A fourth category were people that were self-employed, entrepreneurs, people that own their own businesses. And then the last category was kind of a catch-all for people that were retired, students, people who were unable to work because they were disabled, people who had never worked outside the home for whatever reason, for pay. And so we started identifying people that we knew that fit into those categories to try to get a set for each category. That did not prove successful. For example, I've interviewed 11 people so far, and I think 9 of them are entrepreneurs. How did that happen? I wasn't looking for entrepreneurs necessarily, but I kept finding them. So at this point, we still don't know if that's a fluke of the sampling or not. But so we started with quota-based sampling, and now and then as through finding an individual, we would then ask that interviewee that we had spoken with to refer us to somebody else in one of these categories. And, we just don't know how that happened, at least in my case.
Maybe people are becoming entrepreneurs as a response to this crisis.
Well, there are some interesting things that are going on there in the U.S. and in the UK. I don't know if this would be a good time to talk about some of those differences.
Yeah, definitely. Can you tell us some stories about like some of the things that you're finding, especially because you are all working in different areas of the world? So it's an interesting comparison to see how those things are similar and how they're different.
Well, in the U.S., as I said, we do seem to have a preponderance of entrepreneurs or people who are self-employed. And that is also true for my colleague, Dawn. She is finding a very similar pattern. But if you go and talk to Joe, who's working in Glasgow and, is interviewing all over the UK, people over there do not refer to their work as entrepreneurial or as self-employed. At best, you will get, I'm a freelancer, but you have to, as Joe says, almost drag it out of them.
Wow.
So it is not a recognized category of work or employment. It's not something that people will readily tell you. We don't know all the reasons behind that yet because we're, again, just really early in the interview process, but that is coming to stand as a big difference between the US and the UK. So that's one big difference that we're finding so far.
And then tell us about some of the other stuff that you're finding as well.
In the US, we're finding that people are generally using this period of time as a time of transition. Some people are thinking of it in terms of a time when if they've lost their job, they're thinking, okay, what am I going to do next? So they're sort of forced into a transition, like it or not.
Yeah.
Other people are saying, I've been laid off. I know I'm going to get my job back, but I'm not really sure if this is the kind of work I want to continue doing. And we've had some people saying going back to school.
Okay.
We have had people say had a face-to-face consulting business working with organizations. I'm going fully online. So again, it's a different, staying in the same industry, but transitioning to online. And then we've had people spend a lot of time thinking about what this pandemic means to them in their personal lives. There's a lot of evidence that we're collecting now that people are using the time to reflect and to try to figure out what matters to them, what matters to the family members that they're living with. How should life change? What should the next chapter be? So that's what we're hearing on the American side.
That's pretty interesting because the first two sound very similar to what you heard during the financial crisis. You know, there were a lot of people who were out of work. They were trying to figure out what to do next. And then there were, you know, other responses that kind of you expect in a crisis. But some of the other things that you mentioned about transitioning the way that they're working, that sounds new. I don't recall that being something that was talked about as much during that crisis.
Right.
Also looping in the family portion of that to all these considerations also seems like a newer thing. Because there have been, you know, the financial crisis, I'm referencing that because it was the last time where as a globe, we kind of all experienced something at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Right.
This one, it sounds like there's starting to be this other component of not just how I work, but also how I live that's becoming a part of what's being considered for the future. Does that sound right?
Yes. And I mean, we could hypothesize what's going on there.
Yeah, let's do that.
One possible hypothesis is that this pandemic was pretty sudden. On Tuesday, you had your job, and on Wednesday, you didn't. Almost, you know what I mean? It was that stark and that sudden. With the recession, the 2008 recession, I think that it was much more gradual. It affected some industries more than other industries.
That's true.
And it affected people differentially based on industry and work in that industry. With the pandemic, it is still differential in the sense that some industries are able to continue and others are not. But I guess what we have to see is how people will reshape their futures, given that this was so sudden, unlike the recession, which was more gradual. But the really fascinating thing is, in talking with people in the UK, they're pretty much, at least the ones we've talked to so far, they're pretty much, well, you know, this is a change. The pandemic is definitely a change, but, you know, I'm going back to work. I'm a teacher. I'm going to go back and teach. I'm whatever, and I'm going to go back and do that. And so we were hypothesizing what's going on in the UK, where people don't seem to have this strong emphasis on a personal or professional transition as they seem to in the United States. And the hypothesis there is that the UK has been in the process of dealing with Brexit.
Yeah.
And this is just another continuation, if you will, of a crisis on the heels of Brexit. And Brexit isn't even finished yet.
Right.
And so there's been all this uncertainty in the UK for a fairly extended period of time, as opposed to the US, where the World Health Organization finally declared the pandemic just earlier this winter.
Yeah.
So we're thinking that maybe this, you kind of get used to certain circumstances, certain conditions in the bigger environment, and you start adapting, you start adjusting, you start telling yourself, yeah, things are going to be okay. It's going to work out. And I was just going to say one other thing. And the pandemic is so different than the recession because there's so much death associated with it.
Yeah, which feels very different. It feels like things have to change.
And illness, right. There's death, there's illness, there's exhausted medical workers, exhausted essential workers, people that transport patients inside hospitals. I mean, everyone that works in those kinds of settings is just exhausted. And the rest of us who are not working in those settings are exhausted too, but for totally different reasons. Where we may be stressed out because of all the uncertainty, because of financial issues that we're facing right now, because of all the political back and forths that go on within the media, because of information overload, everything you ever wanted to know about COVID and more. I mean, there are all kinds of things that are happening that make us feel tired.
So true. What I was going to ask you was, do you think that some of these things that we're hypothesizing are also related to the differences in symbols that you're seeing? Because I know that a part of what you're doing with your research, including interviewing, is also asking for the participants to draw pictures. And you had mentioned offline before we started that you're finding some differences in the symbols that are showing up in those pictures. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. Well, there are two different things here. So one part of our methodology is to get people to draw pictures during the brief interviews that we do with them. So that's one thing. We can talk about that in a moment. But there are two symbols that are emerging, one in the US, one in the UK, that seem to be particularly powerful. So in the UK, you will see rainbows. Rainbows are often hand-drawn by children and posted in their windows. And you will see them all over the place. Even 10 Downing Street has a window, has a rainbow. And Joe was lucky enough to interview someone who was responsible for the rainbow concept.
Okay, and what did you find?
And I just wanted to, I have some field notes up here, and I'd just like to read you something. She was the one that she would do some postings online and would post a rainbow because she considered that rainbows were symbols of hope. And so every day she would post a different rainbow, and she didn't want to just use photographs or drawings. So she started using materials that she had around the house. So she said, I'm running around the house trying to find anything that's colorful that I can put it together. One day I had all my books lined up, various different books. Then I've had my embroidery threads. I've had vegetables. I've had pens. So rainbows has taken off in the UK as the symbol of the pandemic and hopefully a symbol of hope for the future. In the US, strange as this might sound, there are hearts in many places. So for example, if you see signs often thanking essential workers or healthcare workers, there are often hearts on the signs. There are hearts associated with storefronts that no longer are open. They've been shuttered because of COVID. And so we're seeing a preponderance of hearts. And again, perhaps as a symbol of togetherness, perhaps as a symbol of love. That might be one explanation. I see that something has been posted as a drawing. Is that it? Can you see that?
I can see the drawing.
Okay. So this particular drawing also has hearts, and it's from the UK. And there's a picture of a house and a sun, and the hearts. And then there below it, it says Zoom. Now that Zoom does not refer to the Zoom platform. It refers to the fact that in the UK, you are not allowed to drive.
Oh.
So this person wants to get into his car and Zoom as soon as that's allowed. I mean, I think that you can drive if under certain circumstances, but you have to.
But there's like
it's not allowed. You can't just go out for a Sunday drive.
Okay. Wow. So I know that this is really early in your research, but what are some of the overall implications that you all are finding that are related to the world of work?
One reason we wanted to do the project right now was because this experience is happening right now. We didn't want to have to wait a year or two to kind of get going. And we wanted to design a project that would enable us to collect both interview data from people who would be willing to share their lives with us, and also their visualizations, their conceptualizations of how they think about today, what it's like in their lives, in their work lives today, and tomorrow, the future, 2 to 5 years out. In terms of what we think might happen in the future, we think that there will be another set of transitions that happen as people get back into the workforce, whether they're in their same job or a totally different job, a brand new job, whatever it happens to be. And that transition is not going to happen overnight.
Right.
It is going to happen gradually, because it has to happen gradually, because we do not have a vaccine. We do not have enough testing. We do not have enough people to do tracing, so contact tracing. And so the transition back into the workforce is going to take time. And decision makers in organizations need to understand it. And then another important implication based on what we can see so far is that organizations themselves are going to have to change as a result of the pandemic. And we talked about this a little bit earlier, but I'd be hard pressed to think that we're just going to go back to a face-to-face world.
Yeah.
First of all, it's far less efficient in many ways. It's important under certain circumstances, but not under all circumstances. I can remember being at General Motors back in the day when it was absolutely essential that people be face-to-face. And under some circumstances, that is absolutely still going to be the case in the future. But I can imagine many other situations where there was no need for people to be there face-to-face. It could have been done online.
Yeah, I've actually seen a lot of articles talking about how work that was done in the 70s predicted that by this point we would all be working online and that we'd all be remote. And it seems that it took this pandemic to kind of push us to actually implement all the technologies that we've created to use in that environment. But I wanted to, before we run out of time, transition to a few of the Q&A we got from the audience.
Sure, go right ahead.
So the first question is, what are some strategies for studying someone's culture fully while they and or you are in lockdown? So some of the things that maybe you all are finding that you're going to have to do because you can't travel the way you normally would or communicate the way you normally would.
Well, all of our not all. I would say the vast majority of the interviews we have done through Zoom. So if I were doing the interview, I would send a Zoom invitation to the person that I was planning to interview, and I could see that person and that person could see me. And so we would have a conversation. And in advance of the conversation, I would make sure it would be okay to record so that I can maintain some level of eye contact. And I know the questions by heart now, so I don't have to keep looking down and referring to them. And then in the process of doing our interviews, we ask for 2 different drawings. And the initial ask is usually met with a whole bunch of laughter, like, oh, I can't draw, I don't know how to draw. And so I usually what we say is, well, we're not looking for artistic excellence here. We just are looking for a concept. You can use stick figures if appropriate. And I think that people relax then, and we get a drawing of what their lives and work lives are like right now, how they conceptualize it. And this is after we have already asked them to describe their lives and work lives.
Wow.
Okay, so now we have a second piece of information, which can be similar or different, but it's probably a bit different. And then the third part of it is we say, okay, now explain to us what you drew. And so at this point, they take that piece of paper and they hold it up to the camera on Zoom so that I can actually see what they've drawn. And then they explain to me what they've drawn and why they drew it. So we repeat that process for their current situation, and then we do it a little bit later on after we've talked a bit about what they expect their lives will be like 2 to 5 years out. And so we end up with 2 different drawings. And that ability to innovate basically on the fly, because we didn't have a way to do the kinds of techniques that we often do use, such as observation, participant observation, collection of lots of documents, focus groups. We didn't have that ability. And so we thought, what can we do? And it just so happens that I had completed a data collection in January of this year where I used this technique, and it worked out, in my view, quite well. So I thought, okay, let's adapt the technique for this particular project and see how it works here. And so far, we've been very pleased with the results. I'll just tell you one quick thing before we end, and that is that one person that Dawn interviewed, so an American, was asked to draw, and this gentleman is in the process of recovering from a stroke. And so he did not have the ability to draw, but he certainly had experienced COVID. And he said, well, I can't really draw, but I'll tell you of a painting that reminds me of how I feel. And it's The Screamer by Edvard Munch.
Yeah.
The Norwegian artist. And so that was his current state. That's how his life was like right now, today. And so then Dawn asked him a bit later on to describe, what his future would be. And he said, yeah, just put up a blank piece of paper. Wow. And so she said, well, why would you say that? And the answer was, because I don't know what my future holds.
So it's really interesting that you are using art as a means of kind of filling in the gaps of typical technologies. Okay, so let's go to the next question. It's a little bit long, so I'm not going to read the whole thing, but what it really is trying to get at is, how do you kind of control for or account for misinformation about COVID-19 in the research that you're doing? So they reference specifically the 5G tower theory that's really prevalent, especially in the UK, and how that has affected the way some people view the virus. But there's also other types of misinformation that's been going on as well.
When an anthropologist goes into any setting, you have to listen to what people say. Whatever they say, their perceptions are important to them and relevant to them. Whether they're true or not, that's not for me to say, because it's all part of how they see the world. It's part of their worldview. And so we don't try to do anything to say, well, I disagree with your view. We're not here to judge. We're here to listen and to try to understand, and then to explain how their perceptions map onto their daily practices.
That's a great answer. So the next question that we have is, are you sharing this research with corporations, my HR department really needs to hear some of the things that you're saying. So what are
Yeah.
your plans for what will happen with the research?
Yes, our goal we had multiple goals in doing this. Our first big goal was to try to help in some way with COVID. And we noticed that there was a preponderance of information on health and illness, on any statistics related to it, on how to try to help kids in school, online learning, but not a whole lot on how people were experiencing COVID at a personal level and at a professional level. And so that was our original motivation for getting going. I'm sorry, could you just repeat the second part of that question? I apologize.
Well, it was really a statement. My HR department needs to hear.
Oh, yes. And so our thought was, this study is for everyone. This study is suitable when we finalize whatever we learn to be packaged in ways that would be suitable for organizations, suitable for the media, suitable for general public presentations of whatever type, in your local library or something like that, a local community group. We would do that packaging based on what we felt those different audiences would be most interested in. So yes, the answer is we are very eager to share what we have learned with others. And, anthropologists are just good at being able to talk to different kinds of people because, as I said earlier, each represents a different perspective. Each has a different set of needs and issues.
Okay, so here's our last question. So, and this one is speaking about technology. They would like to know, have you seen a shift in the way that society is portrayed through the digital platforms that you're using to do the interviewing?
Well, we've only used Zoom.
Yeah, but I think that they're kind of getting to the heart of, like, because we're distanced and we're trying to communicate through these platforms, does it change the way people see society too?
I think that the technology allows you to stay connected in a situation where you are separated. And in fact, we are in the process of applying for funding to continue this work, hopefully as a panel study down the road, and also as a way to share what we're learning with general populations. And so at any rate, I think that this is going to be very helpful for a variety of different groups. And the technology has been able to enhance our ability to, at least so far, to share what we're learning. So tonight we have the Mindshare platform at work.
Well, thank you so much, Elizabeth. It's been great talking to you and going over this research. Do you have any parting things that you would like to say about some of this that you're finding through the COVID-19 research and its relation to work, or even just some of the things that you're finding about how people are changing their lives?
I think that people are extremely creative, and I think people are extremely adaptive. And in what they do in their personal lives and in what they do in their work lives, you can pretty much count on those two features as being a valuable source of strength under these kinds of extraordinary circumstances.
I think that's a great way to end it. Hashtag heart emoji, hashtag rainbow.